So we are going to jump right into this, but before we start, I kind of wanted a little show of hands on how many of you have worked with drip irrigation at your own homes and have installed it. So quite a few. Has anyone not, does anyone have zero experience with it? Okay, well, at the end, I encourage those who have not had any hands-on experience to come up and do punch some holes and connect a few of the connections, just to see that it's very simple to do. But we're not going to have time, probably, most likely we won't have time for the demo until after the next speaker. So this would be at the very end. But I'd be happy to stay, and I really do encourage you to come up and just look over the parts. But we're actually going to skip over a lot of the basics today. I apologize to those who don't have much experience, but you'll catch up in no time. And we want to talk about specifically the laying out of zones. How do you lay out zones? You've got all this stuff in your yard and you want to water it. And how do you divide it up? You know, the schedule plays into it, but you also have limited water spigots and so forth. So I'm going to go through 3 different examples. And as we go, I will hold up the different parts for those of you who are just learning the vernacular here. Oops. So the basics of laying out this and sizing zones. The first thing that you do is you find all the resources available for the DIY, and you familiarize yourself with the parts. And then there are some rules of thumb that I actually installed and volunteered at the school before I knew about the rules of thumb. So that's what I want to make sure that we point that out, and they do come in very helpful in sizing zones. The DIY resources, I had a handful of resources, and then I talked to a friend. I bounced this idea off of a friend who lives down here now, but he had a landscape and yard maintenance company in Seattle for many years, and he said, you don't need all that. Rainbird sets the industry standard, and they really do have a lot of materials online. If you go to rainbird.com, they've got a ton of manuals, but the one I'm showing here and have the link to is their design guide. So, and this talks about a lot of different types of sprinklers. You know, they've got these fancy little misters and bubblers and little mini sprinklers, and I'm keeping it really simple. I don't want to have to mess with all that inventory, so I dumb it down. It's called Drip for Dummies, me. Well, one of the first things I learned in engineering when I went to work at Boeing is the term KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. So the brown drip line is what I use almost everywhere. And if I have a pot, I use one of these single spot emitters with a vinyl line. And if 2 gallons per hour isn't enough, I'll put multiples in. But so that's how we're proceeding. And if you want to go and look at all the fancy stuff when you do landscape, be my guest. It's all there on Rainbird. So, so this is just to familiarize with parts. This is in the workshop we did with the interns back in 23, I think. We went through and introduced all of these parts, and then they had a chance to work with them a little bit. But this is the minimum required, probably, to set up a very basic system. I'll show some of them in the next slide, but as I mentioned, it's just brown drip line. It's the minimum amount of connectors, and it is the timer and the equipment that goes with the timer. There are some requirements there. So the hose timers, or what would be the zone controller in a professionally installed system. The hose timers, they've gotten pretty good. These are actually made by Orbit, and they have 4 zones apiece. You can control these. You can set these up on your Wi-Fi in your house, and when they're out in your field, you can control it from the house. Now mine doesn't work, so I'm not going to tell you to go pay that extra for the Wi-Fi because I've never gotten mine to work. So save the money and do the Bluetooth or manual setting. But I guess it works for some people. But what you really can't quite see, so there's about 2 feet on the other side here is the water supply, and so then Joe at Shorecrest Garden Community installed these. He did a great job, but he put the hose segments to these, and then on the downflow side of the timer is where you have to put all the backflow preventer, the pressure regulator, the filter, and then there's at long last there is a swivel connector that connects the 3/4 inch hose threads, which everything to that point is 3/4 inch hose threads, so here you have the hose threads, and then it connects to the 1/2 inch distribution, polyethylene distribution tube. And so this goes on, and it's like reverse threaded, but you screw this down over it. So that's how you get started. And from there, we're going to go into laying out zones. We're going to assume you know everything you need to know about that, and we'll come and find the information when it comes time. One quick note, lesson learned the hard way. There are 2 different sizes of the distribution line. The Rainbird that I purchased was, well, there's actually 4. There's a 0.63 outside diameter, a 0.67 outside diameter. Then there's a 0.7 and a 0.71 inch outside diameter. Now, these fittings that work with the 0.63 and 0.67 are too small for the 0.7, 0.71, and vice versa. So be aware, whatever size tubing you buy, look at the outside diameter and make sure that the fittings, the connectors that you buy will match, and everything else that needs to marry up with that tubing. I found out the hard way. I'm now consistently 0.7 or 0.71. So the next thing that I mentioned was so you've got your resources, familiarized yourself with the materials, the rules of thumb. So if you Google DIY drip irrigation rules of thumb, you get basically, there might be some slight variations, but you get what's listed on top here. So this 1/2 inch tube shouldn't exceed 200 feet in one zone, nor should the flow of water through that exceed 200 gallons per hour. And we'll get to that. Then the 1/4 inch tube, so this one has no drip emitters. This is just a distribution line. The 1/4 inch drip line, this has the drip emitters. This one specifically has them every 6 inches, and each emitter, typically they're good for a 1/2 gallon per hour. So the 1/4 inch tubing, so that's the 200-200 rule that applies to the 1/2 inch tubing. The 1/4 inch tubing, there's a 30-30 rule. And they say not to exceed 30 feet on the length of a drip line, which I don't even come close to that. The only time I get even close to 30 feet is if I've got both ends plugged in to a 1/2 inch line, because then you can consider it 1/2 as long because it pressurizes from both ends. So I typically stay under 20 feet. A lot of times they're just 10, 12 feet. So the 30-30 rule also is 30 gallons per hour. Well, if you're not getting up to 30 feet, then you can't get to 30 gallons per hour, because at half gallon per hour and 2 emitters per foot, it's 1 gallon per hour. And you have to have 30 feet to get to 30 gallons per hour. So I just recommend staying closer to 20, or plugging in both ends. I do a lot of closed loop because the system pressurizes that much faster and evenly. So then the last overall rule is not to exceed, all of the tubing shouldn't exceed 400 feet. And I can tell you, I went back after the fact and found out that I have exceeded all 3 of these, and it still works. So my friend who had the landscape company said, "Oh, this is so conservative." You know, some engineer sat down and cranked the numbers and added all kinds of factors of fail-proof factors, and you can exceed this. Rainbird themselves advertise 250 feet of half-inch line and 240 gallons per hour. But I would recommend sticking with the 30-30 rule, and then for the half-inch tubing, somewhere in between the 200 and the 240, 250. I have exceeded the 400. It still works fine. We booted it up, and the furthest end got watered not long after turning it on. So, but this guarantees, what they did when they came up with the rule of thumb is they guaranteed that even if you have some leaks in the system or you didn't, you know, it's going to work. So what are we doing? Ooh, I've got 10 minutes, so we're going to speed this up. So after you've gotten through collecting all that information, getting all your site data, which includes identifying your water source, your plants and how much that you want to water and how much water they need, and the soil type and so forth. Because after that, so the soil, you've probably all seen this before, being master gardeners. So, but the soil, even though you can try to figure it out, at the end of the day, you're going to run it and see, okay, if I ran it for 10 minutes, it wet this much soil. And if I run it for 20 minutes, this, and you dial it in yourself. So this is helpful in choosing some of the emitters, but at the end of the day, you're still going to dial it in by what it's actually doing in your yard. The spacing of the drip emitters in the lines will also vary depending on the soil. And it's basically, they're saying, if you have clay soil, you just want slower drips, just administer the water more slowly over a longer period of time. And if it's sandy, shorter time, more water, and loam in between. So the drip lines, the emitters on these drip lines can be at 6 inches or 12 inches. Some are at 18 inches and at 24 inches. I've only used the 6-inch and the 12-inch, mainly because in a vegetable garden, you use 6 or 12 if you want to keep the soil consistent or evenly moist in order to direct sow. And then it serves the purpose really well for the rest of the summer. We learned that at Pioneer School by putting the 6-inch emitters lines spaced at 6 inches, and the kids sowed seeds and they did great. So the other consideration is, of course, the spot emitters and the soil. And then I don't need to tell you guys about considering where to put the drip line for the trees. I have to explain this to my husband, who doesn't understand the root tips that soak up the water are out there. But so we move them back and forth. But then The last thing is developing a layout, which is really hard to do, even after having been an engineer and done lots and lots of drawings and layouts. It's still hard to sit down and put it on paper. It doesn't have to be fancy. I'll show you some a scaled one that I did. I don't have a CAD system, and I got rid of my T-square and everything when I moved. So, but then that layout is what allows you to finally develop the list of parts you're going to need and place the order. And what's important right now is just to know that, be aware that if now is the time to do the layout if you're looking at adding some drip irrigation and order parts, because come June, July, the inventory, it just runs out, and then you're waiting a lot longer for it to be delivered by Amazon. I moved down during COVID, and there was nothing in the store. I tried this for the brick and mortar. Now you can find a little more in the stores now, but and then there's DripWorks that. So if you're not, it's not just Amazon. There are other sources, of course. So, and then there's always, you have to winterize it in the fall, but that's just that schedule is a guideline that we developed. I developed with Lori when working with the Pioneer School on their irrigation, and just kind of abbreviated it for the at home. So the first example we're going to take a look at is the Shorecrest Community Gardens. That's where Carla was one of the interns a couple of years ago, and then she came out and helped and installed this. Their goal was they did want to be able to direct sow. We all agreed the drip lines are very low maintenance. If you do spring a leak, they're low cost to replace. It's pretty obvious a lot of times if there's a hole, it's a sprinkler in the middle of your garden that you shouldn't be there. And we chose 12-inch emitters and located the lines every 12 inches. So they just ran the system a little longer than the 6-inch emitters and 6-inch spacing. So there is a layout, and because it was a perfectly 40-foot by 40-foot garden, I went, this will be easy. And the grid paper that Lori provided, it just fit on that 11 by 17 grid. So, so the red lines that you see are just the half-inch distribution, and the hose timers I showed you earlier are up in this corner. So the half-inch lines do have to run for zone 1. It comes off of one of those, and it runs along the east end, and then this way. But this is a closed loop then here. So, and then these green lines are the drip lines, and those attach at both ends, as do these. They attach at both ends. So you can see the drip lines don't come anywhere close to 30 feet. I'm not going to count squares for you, but if this is 40 and half of that is 20, then you can divide this in half because it's attached at both ends. So we kept those pretty short. So I did add up all the emitters, and we did stay within the guidelines, the rules of thumb. But the one that came the closest, so each zone, we originally, just walking the garden and talking about it, we thought we could do this in maybe one zone and 2 tops. But when I sat down and we actually said, oh, you want to direct sow anywhere in the garden, that is a real, that bumped up the number of zones significantly. If you just were going to water vegetable plants that you planted, starts or something, it could be a whole different story. But so this, each zone is actually pretty close to being maxed out. And oops, uh-oh, what did I do? I missed the button. I was going for the laser. There, thank you. Yeah, that's right. So when I found out that this one actually exceeded the zone 4 because it had all of this, that was the first. I was standing down here when we turned it on the first time, and it all pressurized and was dripping away just beautifully. So you can't, this is a conservative rule of thumb. Let's see. So that was the zone controller from the Shorecrest garden that we talked about earlier. And you can see they had a beautiful garden that provides a lot of produce to the community. So this example is, I have some flower beds in my someday I'm going to have an outdoor living space that's covered, and I really want it to be like a greenhouse, but I want it to have like glass garage doors that open on both sides. So Ben, I'll give you a shout. Did he leave? Oh. But what I needed to know, I had one zone left over from the lawn sprinkler system that we had installed the first summer. And I wanted to know if I could water all 3 of these flower beds off of that one zone. So I know already that the total length of 1/2-inch tube, this is running underneath some weed fabric and pea gravel right now. And I did put a T on it there, and I have shut-off valves, so I can shut off, if it didn't work, I could shut off a zone and water specific beds. So that when I sat down after the fact, this all works beautifully, but it wasn't until after the fact that I went back just yesterday and ran the numbers and said, oh, good, it meets. So I had less than 200 feet of poly, and each bed I had 6. So if each foot is 1 gallon per hour, and I had six 6-foot links in this one, I put dahlias in there. It's 36 gallons per hour. Bed 2, I had about 10-foot lengths. That's 100 gallons per hour. I had a couple drip emitters in pots there, and then I had some 12-foot drip lines, 5 of them for 60 gallons per hour. Ironically, it totals up to 198 gallons per hour, just under 200. It would be fine if it was over, but so I now know that I'm compliant. But I wanted to go through this example so you get a feel for if you want to determine the same thing, that's how you would go about it. And you can scale back on the drip lines and prioritize what gets watered. But because I put dahlias in these beds, so and I want pretty much, you can kind of see, this is a loop. So I do a closed loop where I can. The 1/2-inch line is a loop going around, and then I have the brown tentacles coming out. And then I can just weave them in and out of the plants because I changed this bed. I dug my dahlias this year. The peonies are in there. The different flowers go in and out, and plants are being moved around all the time. So I do pull them out right now. This is what it looks like. And I've got them all hanging out the sides. And when I start planting, then I will weave them in and out. I could put them back in the bed. So as long as there's one going by a dahlia, I've figured out it's good. It doesn't have to wrap all the way around. And they do like their water. And when you can just turn it to run 10, 15 minutes morning and night, and if it gets hot, you can add a midday run. You don't have to even think about it. It's great. I was a slave to watering the first couple of years I was here. So the last example, and I'm going to make this quick, is the yard between the house and the road. It's a work in progress. I will tell you, we don't always, the other half and I don't always agree on the vision. don't have a common vision because we don't have it on paper. This is like the first time I've put something on paper, which is probably long overdue. But I started putting drip line in because when we bought the house, bank owned, and there was a lot of surprise discovery, no disclosure. These rhododendrons along the driveway were dying, and we had 114 degrees. What was it, July 4th or something that summer of 21, was that? Anyway, so I had to get water to them, but in 22, I just put a 1/2-inch line down there and wrapped a brown drip line around those. And you can calculate how much water is coming out of emitters at 6 inches. And you can adjust with the time. But I just deep water those once or twice a week, depending on the temperature. And you set it, and you don't have to worry about it. It runs in the middle of the night too. So the garden, I did put drip lines in the garden because I had, in 22, I had done it at the school, and I went, well, I can go home and do that in my own garden. So I volunteered to help. Well, Lori volunteered me to help at the school, and that's how I learned. We've since been planting trees out in this field, and we have an orchard that the trees actually produce more water when we keep them watered. And the fruit, they produce more fruit, and it looks much better if they get watered during the hot season before they ripen. So I have noticed a difference. And we do have drip lines around the orchard trees, combined with pruning and so forth. But so I was looking at this after I had had a couple zones in, and you also have to think about what else are you going to plant in the future. How many zones do I need, and what materials? Well, I knew what materials I wanted to use. I didn't want more inventory to keep track of. And I had my priorities determined. And the next step was, at this point, I was aware of the rule of thumb. So when I looked at, okay, we want to plant new trees, and the trees, they will get established and won't need the water, but for the first couple of years in the hot season, it's a lot of work to go out and water individual trees. It takes a lot of time to hold that hose. So we just put a loop of 1/2-inch line in each of these berms. There's mulch, wood chips over the soil, and then there's a drip line around each tree. And I know that each of these lines, because this loop cuts that in half, it's a closed loop, they don't come close to 200 feet, maybe 100 feet. And then this one I have to do this summer. We have to replace some trees that right before we closed, a wood truck took out some good-sized trees out by the road. We have what we call the Pickering Triangle. Weird things happen, but we're going to put new trees out there, and it gets a lot of direct sun. So that became a zone. So as far as water, we were fortunate. The previous owner was a farmer, and she put water spigots all over the property. So we have water spigots up and down the driveway. So we're using this one to put a couple zones out by the road, and this one for the garden, the orchard, and this berm, and then the driveway plants. So we do have a vision, but all of this has room to grow. That's the other thing about the rule of thumb, is if you're aware of this, you'll know that you can add more to it as you go. And I can take it out, I can move it around, because things are always changing. And I don't know about you, but I see a plan I like, I have to take it home. So, oops. And then, oops, I didn't mean to go back. Oh, okay. So I did put drip lines, one of the early installations were in the onion bed, and I really enjoyed growing long day onions. And I just do, like I mentioned earlier, test the soil and adjust the time accordingly, because it's so weather dependent too in the summer. And then down the driveway, you can see I need to spread this out during the winter. Tim comes along and tightens them up around the trees, and then I have to go put them back out at the drip lines. But this is a coral bark maple and a rhododendron, and they're much happier, and they've put on some new growth. They were looking really sad when we bought the house, because it had gone through a hot summer without any water. So those have totally come back. So that said, questions?
Well, I have intermittently end-of-season products all the time, but I don't understand how you garden around it. You can't hoe next to it. What do you do?
Oh,
Amy, can you repeat the question so our Zoom audience?
yeah. So what's your name?
Beth.
Beth would like to know, how do you garden around these once they're there? And I do use staples to staple them down, but when I do go to garden around them, well, you saw my winter dahlia bed. I pull all the staples out. I pull them all out of the way so I can dig the dahlias, and I can rake it out and weed and everything. Like under the rhododendrons and the trees, I go down and weed, but it's been a challenge because we've also had deer fence around everything too. But now we think we've got this property secured with gates and things. But so it adds a little time and trouble. But what we've been doing, and I should go back to the beginning, put a lot of wood chips. See, underneath the trees, if that's what it is, in the shrubs, a thick layer. We also have the weed fabric, but we're using cardboard now. And every day I walk down that driveway and pull 20, 30 weeds. So it's just an ongoing battle. But this is now like all wood chipped. These are fairly easy. I use the pointy hoe and hand tools to pull the weeds around the onions and stuff. And it's manageable in a 4x16 bed. You know, all of the beds are manageable. But I hear you. But you can always pull them up and toss them aside and do the gardening and put them back.